Technology. It's advancing faster and taking less time to be widely adopted than ever before.
Launch AI.
AI is basically an emulation of us.
They're one very special person to me.
Autonomous driving started.
AI can give us that answer that we've been seeking all along. Are we alone?
Each time we create a more powerful technology, we create a bigger lever for changing the world.
Welcome to the Shoreline Maritime Risk podcast. In each episode, we'll look at real-time case studies, current events, and speak to the experts dealing with critical risks at sea. What really happens when a crisis strikes at sea? And what can you do to protect your ship?
The volume of data available in the world is growing exponentially. According to recent predictions by International Data Corporation, the amount of data created worldwide in 2025 will be 10 times what it was in 2017. Increased digitalisation of the shipping industry is an inevitability, and the consumption of data analytics to gain deeper maritime domain awareness is on the increase. Indeed, Shoreline are a consumer of data analytics, derived from AIS positional data, and work with leading data analytics firm Windward to establish accurate reporting on Shoreline's insured fleet for every entry, exit, and duration of stay within the United States exclusive economic zone. Windward's artificial intelligence-driven platform processes millions of data points to establish accurate vessel tracking in predefined areas or polygons. Shoreline have used data analytics to re-engineer their internal administrative processes to create significant efficiencies for the business and their client base. In this podcast, I talk to Ron Crean at Windward about digitalisation and the shipping industry, and whether COVID-19 has accelerated our adoption of all things digital.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nick Madlener, and I'd like to welcome you to the next in the series of Shoreline's Maritime Risk podcasts. This one is entitled Data Analytics and the Shipping Industry. I'd like to welcome my guest this morning, Ron Crean, who is VP Commercial at Windward, a leading maritime data analytics firm. And it's worth mentioning that Shoreline is a consumer of Windward's data analytics. So good morning, Ron. Perhaps we could start by you introducing yourself and giving our listeners an overview of Windward's work and reach across the maritime ecosystem.
Morning, Nick. Thanks for the invitation. I think as background, I've been in the maritime industry since the early 90s, so quite a while. And I've worked in various shipping roles, dry cargo ops, all the way through to liner ship, trade management. Done some chartering product tankers, and then it's my first .com, I guess, of relevance to today, about 20 years ago. So I joined. 16 years ago, I joined AIS Live as the first employee, and that was to start the first global AIS network. Now it's like electricity; everybody has it, but at the time, it was net new to the industry. And then that was sold to IHS, so I spent a few more years with them, building up their global trade business, and then worked in strategy, M&A, growth, and then a couple of years at ABP in the UK as group head of marketing for their 21 ports. And then mid last year, I joined Windward. I'd known them for quite a few years, before then. So I'd watched what they'd done with interest. And I always saw them as at the cutting edge, really, of what was happening in shipping. And particularly around, the emerging data science around behavior, which I didn't realize was a thing until a couple of years ago, but now very much is. So I've always had a passion for technology, So it's great to get the opportunity to discuss it with you.
That's great. It's interesting that you point out that the AIS network has been around for the last 16 years, whereas behavior is a relatively new thing. I guess it would be great if you could give an overview of your view of the difference between digitization versus digitalization when we think about digital transformation. I realize there's lots of digitals in that, but it would be good to hear your definition and differences.
Yeah, sure. So I guess when I think about digitization, I see it really as an electronic version of a paper process. And across our industry in particular, I think paper is still king. And I think that really needs to change to cope with the scale of the industry. I mean, just as an example, one large container ship these days, 22,000 TEU vessel potentially has $2 billion of cargo on board. And I think it's fair to say that the processes around the industry are really not geared for that sort of single point of failure or risk. And I think that there's going to have to be an acceleration of innovation around those higher value problems to solve. So I think the key difference is that digitalization, in my opinion, is really focused on the so what. It's more about outcomes and decision support. I think what we really need is a complete rethink of a problem, and then coming up with a completely new way of delivering a solution. I think the key with digitalization is that it puts you in a net new place. It's not speeding up an old process. It isn't faster paper. It's a net new thing. And when it's really good, I think it's based on lots of different data sources, in particular around geospatial intelligence, in order to build a better picture, build better context faster.
So geospatial intelligence, how does that contribute to domain awareness, the maritime domain, and what is it?
Well, essentially, I think if you just take a step back, over the last few years, I think the amount of data that has any sort of time or space attribute to it. So basically something that has the location, latitude, longitude, for example, and then a time attribute. So when did whatever it is that we're interested in occur? So that you've got some sort of history aspect to it. Is it live or is it historical? So that you can start to build trends out of different data sets. And out of those different data sets, what I've seen over the last 20 years of looking at this stuff is it used to be okay to just build layers, and you could build amazing insight by building up layers of linked data sets. And so sometimes data sets that don't even appear linked, which actually become, very connected, where you suddenly start to realize, correlation between data sets that previously you may not have looked at. So things like, aggregation of risk with cruise ships and buildings in Miami, or, catastrophe modeling and risk selection, portfolio modeling, all sorts of things that were really, really quite tough before, are actually a lot easier now. It's still not easy, but the tools are certainly a lot better now than they used to be. And that we're now really looking at things like propensity to risk in future, so really starting to model based on the behavior of the ship, in this case ship, what's that going to do in the next 18 months? And I think that's quite an exciting leap forward from where we were even a couple of years ago.
So of the layers that you've mentioned, obviously the first layer that you mentioned was AIS, and building up a picture of the track of the vessel over time. Another layer could be weather. What other layers would typically be incorporated in creating this rich picture of the maritime domain?
There's so many. At the moment we test on things like radio signals from space, which I think is again, another new leap, which is something that we're looking at. So it's basically trying to augment what's already there. So AIS on its own is very useful as an input. It's very noisy data, so it means you have to have lots of redundancy. You've got to buy the same thing over and over again in order to build in some resilience and redundancy. You've got to be able to add to that with other corresponding sources of insight. So radio is one. You mentioned weather. So there's also, it depends on the problem you're trying to solve, I guess, is the essence of it. But things like wave heights, wind direction, depths from charts. There's a very large range of additional things that we think about. But one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is the new data set that you get from the source itself. So rather than just relying on, say weather or anything else, the net new data set is actually the behavior of the ship and the pattern that it creates over time. And then being able to build pattern analysis with other vessels in other regions that are displaying a similar, mode of operating. I think that for me, has been pretty fascinating. The idea that you can actually create a totally different layer of insight based on something that I thought I knew really well on its own. So just the AIS on its own, I thought was, when I originally did it, I thought it was almost magical. Each time you switched on a new station and you suddenly got insight into an area and you could see everything that was going on in Singapore. And then fast forward a few years now being able to build those extra layers of, even when something goes dark, let's say, or goes, we describe it as sort of dark activity. I guess it's unknown activity. What's it really doing? What's it potentially doing? Is it doing it with somebody else? Who is that? Are they displaying dark activity in their history? And they're just building up that very deep view of the life of a vessel. What's normal, so that you can start to pick out when it does something out of the ordinary. So I think there's a lot of richness in there that you can really pick out.
Very interesting. So the increased availability of data and the building up of layers creates new insights. So I guess the question that our listeners will be asking is the emerging technology. How is that contributing to the industry, and how do you see the increase in data, the increased depth of insight contributing to the industry going forward?
I think it's always about context. For every role, I'm really interested in what difference things like deep data science, artificial intelligence. I'm interested in what difference that makes to people's roles, and the roles of the people that we speak to, underwriters and P&I clubs in particular. They're complicated. They're global. They're 24/7. They have very deep problems to solve, and they usually need to do it quickly. So I think when I think about AI, I think about it as augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, because essentially what we're doing is adding to deep professionals, who have 30, 40 years of experience, let's say. And what we're trying to do is basically say, you carry on doing what you're doing. We'll augment what you're doing by doing some of the heavy lifting. And I think that's really key. So I'd say the big thing is about building better context faster.
Certainly the case with Shoreline's consumption of Windward's data analytics. The problem-solving capabilities of being able to track vessels entering and exiting the US EEZ has made a significant difference to the number of man hours required to create a clear track of Shoreline's portfolio. So I guess probably worth asking in a little more detail about what we mean by big data and what is artificial intelligence, because a lot of people have different definitions. But what is your definition of artificial intelligence, and how do you see it being integral to processing big data?
So let's start with big data. I mean, there's lots of different versions of it. I knew you were going to ask me about it, so I thought rather than give you my definition of it, I'd give you Investopedia's definition of it, and then add my take to that. So Investopedia say it's the big data refers to the large, diverse sets of information that grow at ever-increasing rates. And they say it encompasses the volume of information, the velocity that it's created and collected, and the variety or scope of the data points being covered. So those 3 V's are the sort of traditional characterization of big data, volume, velocity, and variety. But I actually think that there's probably another 2 V's that should be added to that list. And I think that's where we come in, is veracity and value. And I think the veracity of big data is about, it's all very well having thousands and thousands of data points. And we deal with billions of data points, but it's at some point, it's so abstract, it's hard to sort of put it in context, that makes sense on an everyday level. But I think the essence of it is being able to cut through all of that noise and then just picking out the nugget that you need to know for the problem you're trying to solve. And I think that's where artificial intelligence comes in, where we're essentially taking what domain experts understand to be true of the maritime domain and then applying that to specific problems. And I think there's a great article a couple of years ago called Vertical AI, which really neatly explains this. It's worth Googling it after this. Maybe put a link in the notes. But the intention is to consider domain expertise and data science expertise and put them together in a vertical, so that you could answer questions that on the face of it, a generic data scientist looking at a problem may not understand the nuance of what they're looking at. But I think this augmented approach to artificial intelligence is much more interesting, because it means that you've got to have domain expertise to explain what you're looking at, and that's certainly the case in insurance.
So you've mentioned behavioral analytics, which allow us to build a detailed analysis of how vessels are operated. So can you give perhaps some practical applications of how behavioral analytics can be used in the shipping industry?
I think one of the early things with behavior is around how you apply it. So, 3 years ago, applying it to insurance as a start point, because the previous 7 years had been focused on, certainly in Windward's case, had been focused on, governments, intelligence agencies, military, particularly navies, federal agencies, border agencies, and then taking what we learned in those arenas and then applying it in an adjacent market segment. So insurance to start with, and then just over a year ago into sanctions compliance. So one of the things that became apparent is if you look at, I won't go into massive detail about compliance because I want to keep the audience awake. But just in essence, I think one thing that's interesting about it is OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the States, part of the Department of Justice, issued 4 advisories last year and then 1 back in May this year. And what they were asking for was really difficult and increasingly difficult over the 5 advisories. And I think 2 out of the 7 things they asked for were really straightforward stuff. Is it on a list? Yes or no? Did it change flag? Yes or no? Did it go to a port? Yes or no? And all of that stuff is great. It's really pretty easy stuff. Anybody can do that as long as you can operate a database. It's pretty straightforward. But where it becomes much more difficult is for those kind of messy, opaque grey areas, where it's asking about something that isn't obvious. Dark activity. Well, how do you know it's dark activity? Because it's not something that you can just look on the screen and say that looks like dark activity. It can only be known based on its behavior over time. And how can you track behavior over time on 97,000 ships every day? Because it's by its nature, it's opaque. And also the people who are doing it want it to be opaque. And they're really good at it. And every year they get better. So they have patterns of behavior, and we have to learn those patterns and teach the models to look out for those patterns over time. So I think behavior, that's a great example of where behavioral analytics is applied to a brand new problem to solve, because nobody in the industry is really geared up to do that. I spent the last 16, 20 years of my career mostly building those kind of list matching approaches, let's say, where you say, is it on a list, yes or no? With super data and being able to really answer those questions in depth. But I kind of think of that on the left hand side of the continuum almost. In terms of data publishing, which is it's an important thing to do. You've got to do it. You still have to do it. But then there's some heavy lifting to do in the middle. And I guess what I'm interested in with this in terms of behavioral analytics is, how do you get the machine to do the heavy lifting so that essentially by the time it gets to you, the decision maker, whether you're an underwriter or somebody else, that essentially all you've got to do is look at, go, no go decisions. And it's much more about outcomes and decision support rather than inputs, more data. Because I think the last thing people need is more data. What they need is more insight, and even sometimes beyond insight into decision support, which is much more messy and opaque, but it's harder to get to. It's taken us 10 years to get to the point where you can do reliable decision support at scale. So I think there's more to come, but I think behavior is a fascinating area, particularly for maritime, because of the scale of it.
I completely agree. So would you say, in a word, would you say that the integration of data analytics into the shipping industry and the marine insurance industry, would you say that that's about the machines taking over and reducing the amount of manual input, or would you say that it's augmenting what would ordinarily be an extremely difficult, if not impossible, process to manipulate that quantity of data?
I think I've been in shipping for about 26 years, and I started as a chartered shipbroker and then did other things. But the thing that's kind of intrigued me, and this is why I've stayed in the industry for so long, is I love the industry and I love the global nature of it and the people in it. And the thing about shipping is that it requires creativity. And the thing that people are brilliant at is creativity. The thing that, machines are not good at by design is creativity. So I think one of the things with shipping is that it's complex in nature and complicated. So I think if you can use machines to take out the complexity, or use the wisdom of practitioners, let's say, in shipping to solve complex problems, but use the machines to do the heavy lifting. Yeah, so I think basically when it comes to augmentation, there's real depth in the people that we speak to in the industry. It takes a long time to understand the complexity of our industry, different strands of it. you're ever going to replace that, and I don't think you want to. I think the idea here is to keep that creativity, and then apply it to, deeper, bigger problems. As ships get larger, and you've got less ports handling larger vessels with more expensive problems to solve, we need that creativity now more than ever.
Absolutely. So it feels remiss to be talking about data analytics without mentioning COVID-19 and the last 6 months. So do you see that the pandemic has impacted speed of innovation and digitalization in the shipping industry or not?
Yeah, very much so. I think it's been an interesting few months for a number of reasons, but I read somewhere the other day that it had basically collapsed 20 years of innovation into 6 months, because it's an existential crisis. So I think, it's forced people to make decisions that they otherwise may have put off because they may have thought, things were nice to have. But I think, what's been interesting to us is, dealing across banks and energy and insurance, ship owners, law firms globally, and seeing remote execution happening, because they have to, right? So if you've got 300 ships at sea and you're trying to manage them, you don't have a choice. So just because you've been told you've got to operate from home, our customers have had to figure out how to do that, just make it happen. And then from our point of view, supporting those people wherever they are, it just means that we all know what each other's kitchen looks like now, because it's become much more survival mode for a lot of customers. So I think what's been amazing to me is business continuity. It's clear that the ones that are most resilient during these last 6 months will probably be the ones who survive in the next 6 months, 2 years. I think it's thrown up some opportunities as well, which I've seen directly about, things like talent expansion, being able to hire people where they may not be within 10 miles of London, for example, or New York. But you can just find the best people wherever they are, rather than, necessarily in that old paradigm of, are they near one of the major conurbations for shipping, like Stamford in Connecticut or London or Singapore or whatever, or Bermuda. So I think the last 6 months has really shown what rapid innovation under pressure looks like, because we had to, everybody had to, and it's still not done, right? So it's still an emerging situation. But I think what's encouraging to me is that everybody we speak to is still on the end of the line. We're still doing things like this. We did a webinar series that started early this morning, and 1,000 people registered for it. So I'm encouraged by the fact that even during these kind of times, the world still turns, especially ours, in insurance and in technology.
That's been fascinating. The takeaways that I'm hearing are that big data is getting bigger. There is an ability to process it. There are insights coming from that data and that processing of that data from the artificial intelligence, machine learning processes. There are insights which were hitherto unknown, and that creates opportunity, and it's not going away. Certainly, the last 6 months have, if they've done anything, they've accelerated the adoption. It's been really fascinating. Thank you very much, Ron, for joining me today for this podcast, and I'm sure you and I will speak soon, but thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks very much, Nick. Thanks, Shoreline.
We'd like to thank the show's sponsor, Maritime Insurance Solutions Limited. The world and life at sea is changing on a daily basis. Shipping companies and owners are facing evolving threats from political risk to increased maritime cyber risk. Shoreline has the maritime insurance answers you need to make sure your company is covered when crisis strikes. Shoreline are providers of specialist maritime cybercrime and crisis response insurance policies. To learn more about these specialist covers, visit www.shoreline.bm today.